March 1918. The USS Cyclops, one of the largest vessels in the United States Navy, departs Barbados carrying 306 souls and nearly 11,000 tons of manganese ore. Her last transmission was, "Weather fair, all well." Then nothing. No distress call, no wreckage, no bodies. It remains the single largest non-combat loss of life in American naval history. More than a century later, the Cyclops is still missing. To understand how a ship that size could simply vanish, you first need to understand what she was built for and why her final cargo changed everything. William Cramp and Sons, a premier shipbuilder in Philadelphia, laid down the keel of the vessel on June 2, 1909. Launched in May 1910 and commissioned into service on November 7th of that same year, the USS Cyclops was not built for combat. She carried no heavy armor or massive guns to duel with enemy warships. Instead, she was a workhorse, a Proteus-class fleet collier. In the early 20th century, a collier was a specialized bulk cargo support ship designed specifically to transport coal. Coal was the lifeblood of the United States Navy at the time. Steam engines powered the nation's steel fleets, and those engines required a continuous, massive supply of fuel to operate across vast oceans. Without a reliable way to replenish coal bunkers, the Navy's fighting ships were effectively stranded. Colliers served as mobile fueling stations, ensuring the fleet could maintain its presence abroad. The Cyclops was designed to solve this exact logistical challenge. At 542 feet long with a 65-foot beam, she was one of the largest auxiliary vessels in American service. Her massive hull featured a series of deep holds with 4 large hatches per hold, allowing massive crane buckets to quickly load and unload thousands of tons of loose coal. Powered by 2 coal-fired boilers and twin triple-expansion steam engines, she could reach a speed of 15 knots while carrying up to 10,000 tons of fuel. She spent her early career supporting fleet operations along the Atlantic coast, the Caribbean, and even the Baltic Sea, earning a reputation as a dependable, rugged transport built to withstand the heavy burdens of naval logistics. In April 1917, when the United States entered World War I, the Navy placed its entire fleet on a war footing. The Cyclops transitioned from routine peacetime shuttles to high-stakes supply runs. She remained one of the largest auxiliary vessels in American service, but her daily operations became far more demanding. The ship began transporting critical war materials, including dense manganese ore required for steel production. Without her massive cargo holds actively feeding the industrial effort, American steel plants and naval operations faced severe bottlenecks. Command of this important transport fell to Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley. Born in Germany as Johann Friedrich Wichmann, Worley was an experienced but highly eccentric officer who had immigrated to the United States, served during the Spanish-American War, and eventually secured a commission in the Naval Reserve. His leadership style was notoriously harsh, drawing frequent complaints from his officers and crew, who found his erratic behavior and strict discipline difficult to endure. Despite the internal friction, Worley held absolute authority over a massive complement. By early 1918, the ship's roster grew to include 306 crew members and passengers. This group was a diverse cross-section of wartime America, ranging from seasoned naval officers and young enlistees to civilian engineers and high-profile passengers. Every one of these individuals relied on the structural strength of the massive collier and the judgment of her Prussian-born commander. As they prepared for their assignment, the sheer scale of the crew made the vessel a floating community, carrying a heavy human cargo alongside its military stores. On March 3, 1918, The USS Cyclops arrived at the port of Barbados for a brief, unscheduled stop to take on coal, fresh water, and essential provisions. The detour was meant to be temporary, a quick pause before completing the final leg of her voyage to Baltimore, Maryland. Deep inside the holds, the ship carried her maximum cargo capacity, 10,800 tons of dense, heavy manganese ore loaded in Brazil. This dense mineral cargo was needed for American steel production during the war, but it loaded the ship deep into the water, reducing her clearance above the waves to just a few feet. Compounding the weight of the cargo was a serious mechanical limitation. A cracked cylinder in her starboard engine had crippled the vessel's propulsion system. Rather than her usual 15 knots, the ship could only manage about half speed, limping her way northward. Despite these challenges, the departure on the morning of March 4th appeared entirely routine to those on shore. The massive collier weighed anchor and slowly slipped out of the Barbados harbor, heading into the open Atlantic. At 9:30 Greenwich Mean Time, the ship's wireless operator transmitted a brief, final message to the naval chain of command: "Weather fair, all well." That short transmission was the last confirmed contact with the ship. No distress signal was ever sent, and no emergency flares were spotted in the sky. The planned route along the eastern seaboard and past Cape Hatteras remained empty. As the days ticked by, harbor authorities and nearby vessels reported no sightings of the giant collier. Her scheduled arrival on March 13th passed with no sign of the ship. In an instant, the routine voyage turned into a silent void, leaving the Navy to wonder how such a massive vessel could disappear without a trace. The physical reality of the cargo inside the USS Cyclops created a severe engineering hazard long before the ship encountered the open ocean. Designed as a fleet collier, the vessel was engineered specifically to haul coal, a relatively light and dry bulk material. Coal has a density of about 1.3 tons per cubic meter, which naturally filled the massive cargo holds and distributed weight evenly. Manganese ore, by contrast, is a dense, heavy mineral with a bulk density of up to 2.5 tons per cubic meter, nearly twice that of coal. When the crew loaded nearly 11,000 tons of this heavy ore in Brazil, they placed a massive concentration of weight low in the holds, leaving the rest of the vast cargo spaces empty. This concentrated weight forced the USS Cyclops deep into the water, reducing her freeboard, the distance from the water's surface to the main deck, to just a few feet. With so little clearance, even moderate waves could easily wash over the decks, stripping away the ship's reserve buoyancy. The danger was compounded by how the ore was loaded. In 1918, loading relied on manual labor. Workers used shovels to distribute and level the cargo, a process known as trimming. Under intense wartime pressure, speed took priority over precision. To make matters worse, the only officer aboard with experience handling manganese ore, the executive officer, was confined to his cabin under arrest. Without experienced supervision, the dense ore was likely stacked unevenly. Unlike coal, which settles predictably, wet manganese ore behaves like a heavy, fluid mass. If the ship rolled in the ocean swells, this concentrated, unstable weight could slide to one side. In naval engineering, a sudden shift in cargo dramatically reduces the metacentric height, the physical measure of a vessel's ability to right itself. A massive, uneven slide of ore would instantly pull the ship over, causing her to capsize in seconds. The unstable cargo faced its ultimate test when the USS Cyclops limped north into the path of a powerful weather system. Limping along at half speed due to her damaged starboard engine, the heavily laden collier was highly vulnerable to the elements. On March 9th and 10th, 1918, A severe spring gale swept across the Atlantic, generating winds exceeding 35 knots and raising violent 20-foot seas directly along the ship's projected path. For an ordinary vessel, these storm conditions were dangerous but survivable. For the Cyclops, they created a lethal combination of physical forces. Because the heavy manganese ore sat low and dense in her holds, the ship rode dangerously deep in the water, leaving only a few feet of space between the sea and her main deck. As the giant waves crashed over her sides, water flooded the deck, stripping away the ship's remaining reserve buoyancy and putting immense pressure on her hatches. The structural design of the Proteus-class colliers made matters worse. These ships had a documented history of structural weakness, particularly metal fatigue and corrosion in the mean longitudinal girders, which was accelerated by the acidic runoff of mineral cargoes. Under the immense twisting force of the massive waves, the already stressed hull of the Cyclops would have bent and flexed violently, losing its structural rigidity. As the gale battered the crippled vessel, a single large wave likely caused her to roll heavily to one side. Inside the holds, the wet, heavy ore shifted instantly. This sudden movement threw the ship's center of gravity completely out of balance, destroying her physical ability to right herself. In a matter of seconds, the massive collier would have capsized, turning completely upside down and sinking into the deep Atlantic trench. This rapid sequence of events explains why the wireless operator never had time to transmit a distress call. There was no slow, agonizing struggle and no opportunity to launch lifeboats. Instead, a sudden, overwhelming disaster swallowed the ship and all 306 souls aboard. With the nation fully mobilized for World War I, the sudden disappearance of the USS Cyclops immediately triggered intense public anxiety and a wave of sensational theories. The most immediate suspicion fell on enemy combat. Many believed a German U-boat or surface raider had intercepted and sunk the massive collier in the Atlantic. However, official German naval records, or Kriegstagebucher, recovered after the war contained no entries regarding any encounter with the Cyclops. The Imperial German Navy denied any involvement, and no Allied intelligence reports ever placed an enemy vessel in the ship's path. As the search yielded no physical wreckage, public suspicion turned inward. Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, born in Prussia as Johann Friedrich Wichmann, became the central target of espionage rumors. Some crew members had openly questioned his loyalty before the voyage, and the press eagerly circulated theories that the eccentric, German-born officer had sabotaged his own ship or surrendered it to the enemy. Yet, the Navy's subsequent investigations found absolutely no evidence of sabotage, espionage, or betrayal. Worley's harsh leadership style was well documented, but his loyalty to his adopted country was never legally compromised. Other theories of a catastrophic collision or a fatal navigational error also lacked any supporting evidence. No nearby vessels reported a collision, and the ship's clear departure heading left little room for a simple steering mistake to cause a sudden sinking without a distress call. In the busy shipping lanes of the Atlantic seaboard, a collision would have left floating debris or been recorded by another ship. These wartime rumors, though fueled by intense public fear and anti-German sentiment during the height of the conflict, ultimately find no support in the historical record. By stripping away these unsubstantiated claims, the historical record becomes much clearer, leaving investigators with a focused, yet still unanswered mystery that points back to physical and structural vulnerabilities. In April 1918, the United States Navy convened a formal board of investigation to determine what happened to the USS Cyclops. For 90 days, search ships and patrol planes scanned a 2,000-square-mile corridor of the Western Atlantic, stretching from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake Bay. They found no oil slicks, no floating lifeboats, and no debris. With the nation at war and no physical evidence, the Navy officially declared the ship lost and all 306 crew and passengers deceased on June 14, 1918. The board's inquiry examined many possibilities, including engine failure and the heavy manganese cargo, but could not establish a definitive cause. Decades later, the search transitioned into the modern electronic era. Private and academic organizations, including the National Underwater and Marine Agency, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and NOAA, use side-scan and multi-beam sonar to map the seafloor. None of these efforts identified a confirmed wreck. The reason lies in the physical environment of the Atlantic. The ship's projected route passes over the continental shelf into waters ranging from 1,200 to 2,800 feet down. On this seabed, massive underwater currents constantly shift soft, thick sediments. A steel hull resting at these extreme levels for over a century can easily become buried under layers of silt, rendering it virtually invisible to modern acoustic instruments. This absence is not a matter of official indifference, but a direct consequence of how effectively the ocean can conceal a tragedy. For the families of the 306 men aboard, the end of the Navy's search brought only a sparse official telegram. There were no bodies to bury, no personal effects returned, and no final goodbyes. In port cities like Baltimore and communities across Barbados, the sudden loss of so many young men left deep, quiet scars that lasted for generations. The newspapers of the era, including the Baltimore Sun and the New York Times, kept the story on front pages for weeks, feeding a hungry public with rumors of German raiders and internal plots. Over the decades, this media fascination took a more speculative turn. In 1964, writer Vincent Gaddis swept the ship into his newly coined Bermuda Triangle myth, a connection later popularized by other sensational authors. Yet the actual geography of the final voyage refutes this legend. The ship's projected path from Barbados to Baltimore lay hundreds of miles north of the traditional boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle, which connects Miami, Puerto Rico, and Bermuda. By grounding the tragedy in real maritime roots, historians can look past the supernatural and remember the very real human loss that occurred in the cold waters off the American coast. More than a century later, the ocean floor guards its secrets. For the descendants of the crew, the passage of time does not erase the need for closure. Today, the Cyclops reminds us that, despite all our technology, the sea still holds absolute power over our history. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below.